What's up, 1112? A little bit of a unique thing we got going on this week. I'm up in Sacramento teaching, but I didn't want to miss teaching about the evidence for the Bible. Ended up working out really nicely because this one is a little bit more academic and really content heavy. It's one that I probably didn't necessarily need to be in the room for. We're not talking about something that's fairly emotional. It might lead to an emotional conclusion. But this is one that we'll put online and you'll be able to stop and rewind and do that kind of stuff with. We'll also show different charts and graphs and visuals at other times so you can get a good representation of what we're talking about. The basis of this is probably one of the most fundamental foundational questions I get asked as a pastor is, why do you believe in Christianity and not something else, right? So week one we talked about cosmology, then we talked about teleology, the study from or the argument from design, then we talked about morality, and now the question kind of comes with, okay, we've done well to prove that there is a God, or that there is at least something that's maximally great, that is powerful enough to create everything. We talked about the problem of evil last week, but why Christianity? And the why Christianity argument, I think that the argument for any religious belief system boils down to what is their text, like what is your scripture? What do you believe God gave us? Because if God's deist, if he's a deistic God and he's just out there somewhere and never revealed himself to us, then there'd be no reason why, even though we are created uniquely, we should act like it. We should just do whatever we want, whenever we want. But the argument's pretty simple. If someone creates something, he has a purpose for that something. If someone makes a painting, he wants people to feel a certain way when they look at it. If someone creates technology, he wants people to use it or to make a profit from it. You don't just create things haphazardly, especially if you're intelligent enough to create the intricacies of DNA and the uniformity in nature and the constants in mathematics. If you're that purposeful in everything you do, wouldn't you think that the existential beings of man would have purpose? And then what kind of a God would then have purpose for beings but not explain it to them? Which kind of leads to, well, then what's the best explanation of the purpose of mankind? And I believe that the answer to that is you got to look at the different holy books. So if you get a Dharmic religion, which might be like Taoism or Hinduism or Buddhism, or and inside of Buddhism, thousands of different manifestations of that, depending on kind of what you're part and parcel to. And you've got Islam, which makes dramatic claims about what happened in that holy book called the Quran. You've got Mormonism with their Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price and the Doctrine of the Covenants. You've got the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses. You've got their Watchtower. You've got so many different holy books. And the question of why Christianity isn't about it makes the most sense to me, or it's just that when you test the book's validity, and how you test validity, when you go to the root of what the Bible is talking about, I believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it is the only holy book that holds any weight whatsoever. And as far as holding weight in historicity and the importance of a historical document, I believe that the Bible stands unmatched in all ancient documents that there ever was. Not even holy documents, not even religious documents. It stands alone in number of copies made, in the validity of those copies, in the passing down of information, and in the abundance of attestation outside of the Bible. There's just nothing that holds a candle to it. So the question really is, why should we trust the Bible? That's really the question of why would you be a Christian? It's, well, is the Bible trustworthy? So we want to kind of dive into that. Now that there is a God, now let's dive into the framework of, well, what does he want from you? Well, that's a question of religion. And then the question of religion goes down to the text. Let's pull apart the text and say, which of these fits best in history? Which of these makes the greatest logical conclusion through the minimalist facts that we know? When we say minimalist facts, we mean the facts that secular and Christian scholars both agree on. And that's the ones that we want to use. So as a Christian, we can't just walk in and go, well, the Bible's true because Jesus came back from the dead. And we know that because we're Christians. And he must have because it worked for me. Or it must have because I can feel his presence. None of those things have any validity. Because all you need is someone else to have a validity in their belief system, or to try something else and have it work for them, for it to be completely destroyed. The issue is, what I found is most people who would claim to be agnostic or atheist will say, we just can't know the mind of God, which, first of all, that's a faith statement. You're saying that your view of God is he would not be a knowable being, which puts yourself in a position of power, doesn't it? That you would know the mind of God and what he would want from people. Well, I believe in God, I just can't believe that we can know him. That's a faith position. Who said? And if we're going to test that, you can't test it on scientific grounds. And that's where I get sometimes when I'm discussing with people, they'll say, well, if you could scientifically prove to me that the Bible is true, then I would believe it. My pushbacks would be twofold. Number one, when you say something like that, without trying to be offensive, you sound really ignorant, because that's not what we do to prove ancient documents, right? If I showed you writings by Aristotle, right, or Socrates or Plato, or it's probably just a Platonic thing, right? You saw these things, and I said, this is Plato's ethics, or this is the poetry of Aristotle, or this is if I showed you any of that stuff, and then I said, prove to me scientifically it was them, you might scoff and go, you can't prove scientifically that they wrote it, right? The original stuff that they wrote on, the papyri or whatever it is, it's all disintegrated long since. But what we're asking is, did they actually say this? Did they mean this? And are the things that we're holding the same as what they said back then? But most of us don't have a pushback with Aristotle, right? Like the Gallic Wars or Caesar's conquest of that whole region of the planet, we don't really have pushback for any of that stuff. And let me lovingly infer something. There's a reason why we don't have a pushback for those things. Things that are much more poorly attested to than the Bible. We don't have a pushback. Why? Because whether or not Caesar conquered an area of the continent or whatever, we don't really care. He did. We're going to call it history. We're going to test students' ability to remember information inside of a book called the Gallic Wars, which has almost no attestation outside of itself. We can look at archaeological stuff and go, this might or probably may have happened. But as far as us having the original documents or how concise they were to the proper document, we don't really know. But when you go, do you think Caesar existed? We go, of course he existed, right? And if as a Christian or a Christian group came in and said, I don't believe Caesar ever existed, you would go, oh, Christians, right? You would roll your eyes and go, oh, Christians, there you are again, thinking that history isn't true. But the minimalist facts are this. The Bible is so much better attested to than any other book preserved in antiquity, and there's not even something that's close. So why do we throw out the Bible and we produce the Gallic Wars and textbook as historical fact? I think it's this, and this is what I want to lovingly conclude. Our pushback to the Bible is because the Bible expects and requires something from us in return. The Gallic Wars doesn't. So we don't have a problem with it. That's why our pushback is because the things that are found inside of the Bible that speak to you, that's asking something else. That's not just asking, do I believe a historical event took place? The Bible is saying not only did it take place back then, it has implications on your life today. And those implications can sometimes call us into a life that we don't want to give up, or into loving people that we don't want to love, into forgiving things we don't want to forgive, into giving up things that we don't want to give up, or into believing things that we don't want to believe. So let me just ask, as we begin this journey into the biblical text and the evidence for it, are you a clean slate? Are you willing to chase the evidence wherever it leads? And do you have a double standard of a burden of proof when it comes to biblical things as opposed to outside things? And for you to say, well, of course I do, because the Bible says extraordinary things and the Gallic War isn't extraordinary. Well, that's not actually how we do evidence. That's called presuppositionalism. And that says, I assume ahead of time this can't be true, therefore the evidence is going to make it not true. That's not how you do good textual criticism. You look at it, you look at the authors, you look at the internal, external, bibliographical, archaeological, and historicity evidence of a text, and you decide if it's true or not. So when you say, well, I don't believe in the Bible because you can't prove it to me scientifically, well, science can't deal with anything other than that what is observable, measurable, and repeatable, which means when we do this kind of science, it's a branch of science, but it's called evidentiary science or forensic science. When we talk about science, strictly methodological, naturalistic science, through the scientific method, we say, what's your hypothesis? Test the hypothesis, do it in the lab, repeat that, draw conclusions from your results, interpret the data, things like that. And that leads to truth. When it comes to historical things, we ask forensic questions. Who saw this? Is their witness credible? Did other people see it? What was their agenda? Were the people who saw it, were they credited by other credible people? Were there outside corroborative events that seem to go and coincide with this? Do we have personal testimony from people? Do we watch a movement even in a culture? This is forensic evidence, right? Imagine walking into a home and thinking that a murder happened. You can't really do science to find out if a murder happened. Now, you can test a dead body on the floor, but you have to make up a story, but you make up a story based on the evidence. You see a bullet, you see a fragment, you find a motive, you find a witness. But if the only other witness to the crime or not crime was that person's accomplice, two guys murder someone, and the other guy that's on trial goes, no, he didn't do it. And then the other guy goes, no, he didn't do it. We call that an incredible witness or a non-credible witness. Now, some third parties walking by, they just want to get at truth, and they go, no, I saw the whole thing. We would go, okay, that's much easier to believe. But now, what I'm asking you is to be consistent. If you'd be willing to, in a situation like that, let's say someone kills someone in a house, but they were actually living in a glass house, and it was surrounded by 300 people. And they all watched it happen, and they were willing to attest to it, and they wrote it down, and would you go, I need more than that? Or would that be sufficient for you? If they were all credible witnesses, they didn't have an agenda outside of it. In fact, some of them, someone put a gun to their head and said, if you say they didn't actually commit murder in this house, I'm going to let you go. And they say, here I stand, I can do no other. I saw what I saw, this is what happened. And then you shot people one at a time. Boom, 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 boom. And people still stood up and gave testimony and went, I know what you want me to say, but I'm not going to say it. I saw it with my own eyes. And then they faced the bullet as well. In our culture, at this time, in this moment, in that circumstance, wouldn't we draw the conclusion pretty innately and pretty quickly that this thing was true? So that is a logical fallacy to say a burden of proof must be different in this scenario than in this scenario, just because the claims here are ones that I wasn't there to observe, I'm not familiar with, and I'm not comfortable with them. Now, at the end, you can still draw your own conclusion. You can say that all this evidence points to a different one, but I need to ask you a question. At the end of all of this evidence, what is your hypothesis of what actually happened? You can't just look at it and go, interesting. There's a book by a guy named Josh McDowell, which I think is probably the best overarching proof of the Bible. He goes into detail. I mean, it takes about 3.5 days to read this. It's a huge textbook that goes through the actual data, the actual evidence, every single manuscript and every outside witness. And he says, this is all evidence, but it demands a verdict. A verdict in a trial is someone who goes, guilty, not guilty. Would you be willing to, at the end of this, go, I'm going to put my chips somewhere? You got a whole bunch of chips sitting in front of you. It's your life, it's your sexuality, it's your purpose, it's your worth, it's your success, it's what you view as meaningful in your life, it's the way you treat people, love people, honor your parents. These are all things that you have a choice to make. And if you push it in one direction, which is there is no God, you're going all in. That this is all that there is, the world is all that there is, there's nothing else outside of this. Naturalism reigns supreme. You push all your chips on that. Then you should live in concert with that theory. However, if when all the evidence is presented, you go, there isn't a theory that makes sense other than a resurrected Jesus Christ, the validity of the scriptures, and if he's called me to live a different way, then I know it's a high cost, but it's one that I'm willing to pay. I'm inviting you to that bifurcation today, to that dichotomy. And again, at the Skeptics Forum Sunday night, we'll be able to answer questions in Q&A, so make sure you write down questions as we're going through. So let's dive in. The first thing we do when we look at ancient documents is we look at the manuscript evidence, okay? This is also called the bibliographical test. We want to look at, are the authors who have said to have been written these documents, are they the actual authors? Are they who they said they were? Secondly, we want to look at manuscript. Are the things they wrote what they actually wrote? We want to look at then, are the things that they wrote, did they actually happen? And fourth, we want to look at, do the things that they wrote, are they the things that we're holding today? That's called the manuscript evidence of it. And we want to take all those things, and that's one of what I would guess is probably 4 different things we use to test ancient documents when you ask the majority of scholars. The issue with Christians is when you start talking about manuscript evidence, this might be brand new information for them. And it's a little bit tragic because in most classroom settings, all it takes for someone to disprove most Christians' belief is to ask a simple question. What do you believe about X? Right? You can use whatever you want. Let's say, what do you believe about murder? And you would go, well, murder is wrong. The Christian might say murder is wrong. To which the atheist responds, well, why is murder wrong? And you would say, because it hurts someone a little bit. But on a Christian worldview, murder is wrong because the Bible says so, because God has revealed that to us. Now the atheist, licking his chops, get to ask the question, well, why should I trust the Bible? Why do you choose to believe that the Bible is accurate and true and reliable? To which now the common Christian has almost no response to that question. It is of the utmost importance. If our documents about what is revealed about God and Jesus are incorrect, then our whole belief system is off. But if they're accurate, then it causes us to lean in and put our chips in. But most people are stumped. Well, I believe that divorce is wrong because the Bible says so. Why do you believe the Bible? Because God wrote it? How do you know God wrote it? Well, the Bible says so. Well, why should I trust that the Bible says that? Well, because God wrote it. It's called circular argumentation. Most Christians will get caught up in that, which means you need a better answer for the critic. And I want to give you a better answer for you guys that are sitting there that are critics, that when you say, well, why should I trust the Bible? Here's something that I want to give you. If someone asks me why I believe the Bible, why I choose to believe the Bible, I will tell them, I believe the Bible is accurate because it is a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses who record supernatural events in fulfillment of specific prophecies and whose authors claims their writings are divine rather than human in origin. I believe in the Bible because it's a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses who report supernatural events in fulfillment of specific prophecies and whose authors claim their writings to be divine rather than human in origin. There's my answer. Well, that's a mouthful. That's a lot. Break it down. That's what we're going to do today. We don't have a lot of time to do it, but we're going to race through it. We'll be able to answer more questions at the forum on Sunday night. But that manuscript evidence is that first part. That leads to the confidence that we have in the biblical text being true. Are the things that we wrote, are the authors, the actual authors that it says in the text, are those authors credible? Are the documents that they wrote actual events that took place? And lastly, are we holding the same things that they wrote back then? So this is a bibliographical text. And to dive into that, what you can look at is you can look at some of these old documents that we do take to be true and understand what it takes to consider something to be valid from a historical document. And again, we'll put up a slide here in a second that talks through some of it. It'll just show a little bit of a picture of some of these different dates. And you'll see the difference. The way that we test documents is how many copies were made of the original, because they're made on papyrus, so they break down. So obviously, if 1,000 people were to sit down with a sheet of paper and I said, guys, never forget this. Everyone, lean in. Come bring a piece of paper and come back and start recording exactly what I've written down. I saw it firsthand. Let me tell you what occurred. And now I've written that thing down. That's called the original. We call it the original, right? When Mark writes down what Jesus did, it's called the original. When Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, it's the original. Now, you come over here, and people from all over come and they copy that original thing and then they take it out. Now, here's the thing. You might go, well, it's like a game of telephone then, right? One person hears a story, and then by the time it gets to the third or fourth generation, it's all, so we can't really trust the Bible that we've been given today. The issue with that is if you want to write a Bible even today, if you want to write a translation of the Bible, maybe not to change anything or change concepts, right? You go, well, there's so many versions of the Bible. Yeah, but as far as the Holy Bible is concerned, the difference in those is syntax, whether it's a translation from word to word or thought to thought or paraphrase version, because, well, not to be rude, but 60 years ago, the average person read at about a 12th grade level. Today, the average person reads at a 5th grade level. So you're right, we're getting new translations all the time. Certain parts of the country understand different words in a certain way. As we've gone through the ages, even words that have become taboo in our culture, right? You can think of certain words that a couple generations ago they would use commonly to talk about a female dog or to talk about a donkey in a certain way that the text has that we went, you know what? A donkey is the same thing as that, but let's call it something different, right? Same thing with almost anything else in Scripture. So we want to look at those things and say, what are those in particular notions or thoughts that the different translations are going to move, but it doesn't mean it's different. Now, when you're talking about making a translation, though, you have to actually go back to the original. So the only way that telephone game would work is if I tell person A a story, they tell person B, they tell person C, they tell person D, and person Z comes back to me and goes, hey, here's what I heard. And I would go, that's nowhere near the original. So you're right. Man, aren't we dead in the water at that point? The issue is that's not how you write the Bible. That's not how you translate the Bible. When you want to make a version of the Bible, you have to learn the original languages and you have to go back to the original documents. That's what they did. You had to learn Hebrew, Aramaic, Akkadian. You had to learn all the different ways that the Bible was written in Greek and Koine, and you had to go back and you had to go to the original version. So that only holds weight. The telephone argument only holds weight if it's A, we need to be in a different oral history, which we're not in today, right? When we tell stories, we don't even really listen when people are talking, right? Because we can write stuff down or we can text people, right? Even my wife is like, hey, can you go get some Chipotle? Sweet, you got it. What's your order? And then she'll start telling me it. About 2 words in, what do I say? Just text me so I can have it in front of me. Why? Because we don't do oral history. That's not how we remember stuff in our culture. But we've become culturally insensitive to memory. Now, their culture, especially in a religious culture where religion was the most important thing in the world, they're hearing stories about their Messiah, and they're in an oral tradition culture, which means when someone tells you their Chipotle order in first century Israel, you don't forget that because you have to remember everything. So the brain, right? There's so many studies being done even today about the attention span. Like even you watching this video, some of you are already tuned out and you want to be on your phone. You want to be doing this stuff. Why? Because our attention spans are shorter. And if we need information, you can go back and watch this. You can write it down and you can have it. Now, in a culture where a lot of people were illiterate, you remembered everything orally. So, A, the way that we remember things orally is not the same as them. 2, in order to translate something, you went back to the source. We would expect person A through Z to all have a slightly different variation of the story, unless it was necessary because of the importance of the religious elite and the power of the words that were written. That person A come to me, person B come to me, person C come to me, person D, E, F, G, all the way down to Z. If everyone comes back to the original copy and transcribes from that, how much error would you expect there to be? Certainly not when it's orally translated through 26 people. But when 26 people come to the same one, yeah, you're going to have some people that misspell a word. And so what we hold today, because we're able to find him in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, about 50 years ago, this kid was throwing rocks up in a cave in a place called Qumran in Israel, in the outskirts of Israel, and he hits a jar, and that jar is open up, and there's literally texts from 300 BC talking about who this Jesus was going to be and what he was going to do 300 years ahead of time. And when we find those things, we now hold so many copies of the original documents from the first century that we know that those documents are accurate to one another. So all this idea of variation and telephone game and men are immoral and they're messed up and they've created legend. The issue is this. The documents that we have found are within 99.5% validity, and the error in that 0.5%, anywhere from 0.5 to 0.7%, 99.5 to 9.7%, the errors in that 0.5 to 0.3% are due to misspellings, syntax error, or missing pieces of papyri that we know what the word is, but we can't exactly write it in full. But it changes nothing about the salvific history. It changes nothing about what Jesus did or who he was or who he claimed to be. Right? For a while, we thought that the Palestinians or the Philistines, which are Old Testament Palestinians, we thought that the Philistines were called the people of the Purple Hills because one of the letters was misspelled, and we translated that and we found out the answer. But whether the Philistines are called the people of the Purple Hills or the people of great power, does that change their argument with the Israelites? Does it change the salvific history of anything? No. So the error is in there. You go, if you want to build your whole worldview on the fact that there's 0.3 to 0.5% variation in the text, the issue is if you falsify with that, you have to throw away everything in history when it comes to ancient documents. You literally have to say, if we can't write it down today, it's impossible. And there was one guy who said, well, there's 500,000 errors in the text of the Bible. Well, the issue is, he said there's one error in this part, like there was a misplaced comma or there was a misspelling of a word, and then that book was produced, and that single Bible was produced 500,000 times, so he calls it 500,000 errors. Is that reasonable? In fact, in that guy's book where he refuted this stuff, he made 17 syntactical errors. And he sold 200,000 copies of it. So can we say that then you made 200,000 times 17 errors? No. Do you understand the different burden of proof? You understand how the field goal posts, they shift depending on if we're talking about the Bible and we're talking about something else? When it's the Bible, we go, you're not going to get it. You can't prove it true. But when it's Caesar or it's Aristotle, we put it right here and then we make the field goal post wider and we go, let's just accept it as truth. We have to understand, whether you're a Christian or secularist in this room, we put a burden of proof in the Bible that is unlike anything else, but our reasoning is simple. The Bible calls us to do something. So the manuscript evidence is first. The pushback of the manuscript evidence is falsified because the pushback is, well, do we have the actual originals? Yes, we can do textual criticism to 99.7 to 99.5% of the documents that were originally there are written by the people who said that they were, 40 different authors, 3 different continents, 3 different languages, all telling the exact same story over 1,500 years in the written process. It checks out. The manuscript evidence checks out. The next thing we look at is archaeological evidence. Are the things, or this is also a test of internal consistency, which is, are the things that are talked about in the Bible, did they actually occur outside of it, or was it all self-contained? Well, we have to look at archaeology, right? Are there outside sources that corroborate it? At this point, there's been 25,000 archaeological digs done in Israel. On the Bible itself, 25,000 times someone put spade to dirt in Israel and said, let's dig this up, after 25,000 archaeological digs, aiming to both credit and falsify the Bible. Not a single one has done anything to falsify a single bit of the Bible. In fact, it's so powerful, I want to read you this from the Smithsonian Institute. And here's what it says. Again, if I asked you just pretty simply, do you believe that the Smithsonian Institute has any kind of agenda for the Christian? You ought to answer no, or else you don't know anything about the Smithsonian Institute. If there's anyone who wants to say the Bible is false, it would be these two people. And this is why we use minimalist facts. Much of the Bible, in particular the historical books of the Old Testament, are as accurate historical documents as any that we have found from antiquity, that means from ancient times, and are in fact more accurate than many of the Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or even Greek histories. These biblical records can be and are used as are other ancient documents in archaeological work. For their part, historical events described took place and the people cited really did exist. That's from the Smithsonian Anthropological Department. The same people who are saying this is the age of the earth and they're trying to refute the Bible are forced to write that down. National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C. said this: archaeologists do indeed find the Bible a valuable reference tool and use it many times for geographical relationships, old names, and relative chronologies. So these are people outside of the Bible who they don't have an agenda. In fact, they would love to go, this is BS. There's nothing here worth looking at. And after 25,000 archaeological digs, they are forced to, probably against their will, go, fine. Yes, we have found these sites. Yes, we know where this is. Yes, this is true. In fact, the first time I went to Israel, people were questioning the Bible's validity because they said, well, there's all these different names and events they took place, but there's no place called Migdala, and there's a woman called Mary Magdalene. The irony is, last time I was there, this guy tried to build a gas station in the ancient Near East, and he was digging and actually hit the city of Migdala. Now it's been excavated as an archaeological site, but here's the issue. Those people who are questioning the validity of all these places, when they get dug up, they don't come back and go, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. They just look for other things to try to disprove. And yet after 25,000 of these things that they tried to disprove and it came back as truth, they're still going, oh, well, I'll find something else. Do you get it? Do you get the perceived heart of that? Do you get that this isn't the same? If we were talking about the Gaelic Wars, if we were talking about Atlantis, think about if we were talking about Atlantis, and there was this place, and we found 25,000 areas of proof and things in antiquity, wouldn't we all come to the same conclusion that Atlantis was probably a real place? But Atlantis doesn't require anything of us. That's the difference. So we got to be careful to have the same burden of proof across, and the incredulity of whether it was supernatural or not, that actually doesn't have any part in this. The question is the Bible reliable and accurate, and are the events more likely than not trustworthy? And that's how we do our archaeological evidence. So 25,000 digs, not one has falsified it. We also have prophetic evidence. These are prophets. In the Old Testament, God said, I'm going to send my son, but I don't want you to miss him. I don't want you to follow some false Messiah. So let me give you hundreds of prophecies about what this guy would be. Not vague Nostradamus-like prophecies like he's going to have hair. He's going to probably have back problems at some time in his life. These were things like he's going to be born while a certain governor. He quotes people by name. This guy is going to be, Isaiah 53 says he's going to be the suffering servant, a man familiar with pain, despised by many, by whom men turn their face. In fact, we have this one phrase we have this one chapter in Psalm 22, which is written 1,500 years before Jesus even comes up on the scene. And if I showed you this part of Psalms, it says, the psalmist is writing a prophecy, and he says, I am a worm and not a man, despised by many. And then it says, my bones are out of joint. My heart has been turned to wax. They pierced my hands and my feet. Evil men encircle me. Brazen bulls of Bashan encircle me. They cast lots for my clothes. I am mocked. They hurl insults at me. If you are God, then save yourself, they scream at me. And for anyone who's familiar with the crucifixion story, what do we all jump to? If I asked you that and I said, who are we talking about? They pierced my hands and my feet. I'm surrounded by robbers on both sides. These dogs encircle me. They cast lots for my clothing. My bones are out of joint. I'm thirsty, the text says. Almost anyone who's familiar at all with the Bible would go, well, that's the crucifixion story. That's Jesus. You go, but that doesn't prove anything. Because all they did is someone watched their crucifixion story, and then they went and they wrote ahead of time, and you can't even prove that's the way that it was. Someone just saw it, and then they went back and they changed the text. Here's the issue with that theory. These texts that are calling this crucifixion, and they are prophesying about what's going to happen, are written hundreds of years before Rome is in power, before crucifixion ever happens, before Jesus comes on the planet. And here's something crazier. We actually have proof now that there are scrolls from Isaiah that remain untouched from 300 BC to 1960 AD. Which means your theory of, well, people went back and changed it, all the prophecies were buried. And we didn't find them until the 1960s. So, right, the issue would be, let's say right now I give everyone in this room, I put a piece of paper in your hand, and on that piece of paper were 1 trillion numbers. I don't know how I fit on a piece of paper. That's not relevant at this point. But I had 1 trillion numbers on it. And then I asked someone, I said, pick 77 numbers randomly out of 1 trillion numbers. And then I looked around and I went, you. Everyone in the room, you're going to pick 7 numbers. And this random number generator between 1 and 1 trillion is going to pick 7 numbers as well. And then I went and I grabbed your piece of paper and I looked at it. And I saw it. And then they generated 7 numbers randomly. And then I saw someone in the back scribbling and going, and then they matched. I would go, you looked at those numbers and then you came up with it. But now imagine if I grabbed everyone's piece of paper and they all turned it into me, and I covered it and I saved it as if my life depended on it, as if it was the most important thing in the world, and I buried it in the ground, never to be touched. And radio dating and carbon dating and all these other things, spectrometry, are going to be able to prove that nothing has touched this. Then after they're buried, 300 years later, all the way up to 1,000 years later, I push go on that random number generator, and it gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different numbers. Some of them are obviously 2,376,477,113. That's one of the numbers. Another number might be 42,375,199. And now let's say someone in our classroom, we grabbed it and all the numbers matched perfectly. That's the difference. So you can't use it's called the overzealous monk argument, that people saw what was happening and then went back and changed the text. The issue is some of these texts were buried way long before Jesus ever showed up. And with 300 and some odd Christological prophecies, which means prophecies about Jesus, the odds of that happening, someone cited this one time, they said the odds of even 16 of those prophecies happening are 1 in 10 to the 45th power. That's like covering the state of Texas 5 miles deep in silver dollars and painting one of those silver dollars red and then mixing up the whole state. And you blindfolded walk on top of all of that, of all those silver dollars covering the whole state of Texas. By the way, if you just walked off the state of Texas, just foot by foot by foot, covering every square foot, it would take you almost 1 billion years to do so. So we're not going to get there. Now, I'll give you 1 billion years to walk it off, and then you stop at one point in the whole state of Texas. Texas is It's a huge section of the whole United States is Texas, right? And then you walk on it, and then at one point you just stop blindfold, and you go, okay, now I want to go down 2 miles and 376 feet, and then you grab one of those coins, and it's got to be the red one. That's the odds of just 16 of more than 300 being true of these prophecies. And the reason that we know they're true is because they were buried. We didn't touch them. We can't touch them. We can't manipulate them. We can't falsify them. We can't make them more legendary. And the documents over here, that the way it actually played out and firsthand witnesses seeing them, they would have no reason. In fact, there were hostile witnesses who would love to go, this didn't happen, but you don't find any other account of Jesus' life, ministry, death, burial, and resurrection than what is found in the scriptures. You don't find a single other one. You find other people talking about what happened. In fact, there's actually a decree that went out called the Nazareth inscription, and it was found, it dates back to the 1st century AD, where someone was so mad at what had happened because of the rise of Jesus that they actually made an inscription on something that said, stop touching religious figures' bodies. Because we have an argument right now, they said, between did Jesus come back from the dead? And some people, trying to not get themselves killed, said, oh no, the disciples stole the body. Okay? The Nazareth inscription says, okay, here's how we're going to solve this. And if anyone walks into a tomb of someone who's dead, we're going to kill him. Okay? So what does that do for us? Well, what does it tell us? It tells us that there's no body. The leading group of people who said, oh, he didn't actually raise from the dead, didn't say there was a body there. No one produced a corpse. They just said someone must have stolen them. And we'll get to that in a second. But that's, again, do you understand what I'm saying? People who are making all these theories are still arguing that the events actually took place. No one's saying anything else. The prophetic evidence of him being in a borrowed tomb, being born in Bethlehem, in Nazareth, and if you just talk about his lineage, it has come from either 3 guys after the flood. Noah gave birth to 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It says he's going to be from the line of Shem, then he's going to be from the line of Judah, and he's going to be from the house of David, and he's going to be from the tribe of... And if you just do the odds on those things, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, 3 sons, 1 out of 3. And then he's got 12 sons, so 1 out of 12, and then 12 again, and then 1 out of 12, and then 1 out of 8 of Abraham's sons, or whatever it is, right? You have to keep just multiplying. Just his lineage is an astronomical number. And the fact that we can trace back his lineage to the beginning and know that Jesus came from this line, those are called prophecies. That certain events would take place, that certain cities would be desolated, that certain people groups would return. It says that there's a man who will make a decree that all the Israelites can return back to Israel. And then a man named Cyrus decrees and we see this movement in archaeology of Israelites returning back to their homeland. So the prophetic evidence, God says, I don't want you to take it on blind faith. Let me call the shot. Wait for the random number generator, or you think it's random. I'm going to bury my prediction in the ground. I'm going to bury 300 just about Jesus. Not to mention the other 1,000 or so that are just about things that are outside of Jesus, like the way that the world would receive, just the Christological ones. He says, I'm going to bury 300 of them in the ground. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show off. I'm going to stick them in Qumran. You're not going to find them till the 1960s. When a whole bunch of people who go, oh, well, someone falsified. We don't make that argument in the 1960s. We don't. Because everyone's a skeptic at this point, and they're trying to falsify them. And now we're forced to go, in the 20th century, we find these things that we date before Jesus even came to the planet, before Rome was ever in power, that are predicting what Jesus would do. And anyone who reads Psalm 22 goes, man, this is talking about a crucifixion. And it's such prophetic and profound evidence. When Jesus is on the cross, guess what he says? He says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is the first line of Psalm 22. The first line of Psalm 22 is that Hebrew or that Aramaic phrase. So what was Jesus doing on the cross? What did he say? You see, back then they didn't have open your Bibles to Psalm chapter 22, verse 1. The Masoretes inputted the numbers and the big numbers and small numbers. So the way that you used to tell people to turn to something is you would recite the first line called Ramez. And you would say, turn to Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And remember, the Psalms were written as a song book, not as a normal inscription. So that means everyone in the audience that was mostly Jewish and very religious would have been familiar with every song they sang. That would be like if today I got up somewhere and I said, big wheels keep on turning, right? If I was on the cross and I said that, you would go, what is he trying to say? Carry me home, sweet home Alabama, what are you talking about? And Jesus starts to sing the first line of a song where he's going, do you guys get it? It's about me. As he's dying on the cross, all these Jews who've known Psalm 22 forever, Jesus goes, I know you didn't mean to do this, but think about Psalm 22. And they start going, Psalm 22, it says The psalmist is writing, says, I am a worm and not a man, despised by many. I'm encircled by thieves. They pierced my hands and my feet. My mouth is dry. So what does Jesus say out loud? I am thirsty. He says, my bones are out of joint, but they're not broken, which is a prophecy from the Old Testament. My heart is turned to wax. The soldier pierces the pericardial sac where blood and water flow separately. It says they cast lots. And as the Jews look over, the Jewish elite, they look over and see the Roman guards casting lots. And Gentiles, which would have been Romans, were called in the Old Testament, the New Testament, they're called dogs, as Jesus talks about them in the New Testament. And Jesus, before he dies, he goes, hey, remember that prophecy? Look what's happening. So Jesus was well aware. The prophetic evidence is very important. Last thing that we look at manuscript evidence. Are the documents we have reliable? Are they trustworthy? Is there external corroboration of what's happened? Is there internal consistency within the text? All these things are true. Is there prophetic evidence? Absolutely. Then we want to look at, well, what about some of the things that it claimed? Is there corroboration for the miracles? And if you said, well, prove to me that Jesus turned water into wine, how would I even do that? Like, with all reasonability, how would someone prove that Jesus walked on water? How would someone prove that Jesus fed 5,000 people? If you had like the most brazen thing you could say is, well, if a whole bunch of people saw it and they were credible and then they wrote about it, that would be the best thing you could do. So either you have to say that everything before we had pictures is false, or you have to have a system by which you would accept something as true. And so what I want to do is I want to take the pièce de résistance, as it were, the resurrection itself. And I want to give you just a few minimalist facts when it comes to the resurrection. And then with all these things in tandem, make a decision about what you believe concerning the Bible. First of all, when it comes to the resurrection, Jesus said that he was going to die and come back from the dead. In fact, that's what he was put on trial for. He said, you destroy this temple and I will restore it in 3 days. Right? He's talking about himself. He's talking about his own body. And the reason that he was crucified is because they went, he's claiming to tear down our temple. And Jesus said, no, you're going to destroy this temple and I'm going to come back to life in 3 days. He also prophesied, Jesus says about himself, as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth, and then he'll come back from the dead. He predicts his own death a dozen or so times before he actually dies. And then he dies. And that is well attested to. It says the 3 things of first importance from 1 Corinthians. It says that Jesus was killed, buried, and came back from the dead. So the minimalist facts of the resurrection are this. A, all his disciples claimed to have seen him after he was resurrected. B, the disciples with credibility, because their other things were accredited and they were valuable, like Paul himself. He was a historian of the first rank, F.F. Bruce says, a New Testament scholar. Paul says, at one point, there was 500 people at once that saw him. What do you do with that? And then he says, not only were there 500 people, he said 300 of them are still alive. In other words, go ask him. He even quotes some people. In the Bible, Jesus, they call him Alex the coppersmith. In other words, you know who Alex is, the coppersmith. Go ask him. So he creates falsifiable evidence. He gives us permission to go test it. You wouldn't do that if it was a hoax. It just doesn't make any sense. Another minimalist fact, the conversion of Paul. The second most influential man who's ever lived. Time magazine gives him that title. Why? Because this man used to be part of the Sanhedrin. He was well known. He's written about everywhere. And then all of a sudden he becomes this Jesus freak who walks around talking about having seen Jesus come back from the dead and have him be resurrected. Now, I was with a debate with someone one time and they said, oh, well, now, modern people would say maybe he just had a seizure and that's just what he thought. But do you get what happened? What you just did when you go, well, Paul's conversion was due to a seizure. It doesn't make sense that it would actually be God himself. Maybe it was just a seizure and he changed his mind. But what did you just affirm? You just affirmed that what Paul said was true. You affirmed that Paul actually changed. You affirmed that Paul actually brought that message out. Your reasoning for why he changed was just different. But it's so based in fact that everyone goes, sure, the tomb was empty. That's actually a minimalist fact. An empty tomb, everyone agrees. And some people go, well, maybe the disciples overpowered the guards. Yeah, that makes sense. You've got a Roman centurion with all of his trained soldiers with their weaponry. You have a bunch of soldiers who are hiding because they're terrified of what just happened, who are all under the penalty and the threat of death. And then they all of a sudden became brazen and went and overtook trained Roman guards, even though these people were just fishermen a few days before. Their livelihood, they weren't trained. They're going to take on a Roman army? Does that make sense? Oh, well, maybe Jesus didn't actually die. It's called the swoon theory. Maybe he was just punished and they thought he was dead, so they took him off the cross and they put him in the tomb. First of all, you just also affirmed that Jesus came back from the dead, but you just said, well, maybe he didn't die. But you guys get that swoon theory? He was beaten within an inch of his life. His pericardial sac was ruptured and the blood and water flowed separately, which means he was dead. And if anyone was able to kill people quickly, it was probably the Romans. Like they were the best at murdering people of anyone. They were just good at it. They killed people all the time. It was very often you would walk into a Roman town and there'd be people on crosses just lining it. We have nothing else in all of recorded history that says anyone ever survived a Roman execution. Do you get how many concessions are made if you go, well, I know that the odds of this are astronomical, and this are astronomical, and this are astronomical, and this are astronomical, but what if Jesus accidentally fulfilled all the prophecies, even though that would be 1 in 10 to the 45th for only 16 of them, of which there are 300. And what if one time they did actually miss it, and it was Jesus, who happened to be the only guy who ever claimed to be crucified and then come back from the dead, who on the cross quotes the Old Testament, which is fulfilled in the 300 BC to the 1960s AD in the caves at Qumran, where the guards were overpowered by people, which we also haven't seen because they were the most powerful people group on the whole planet. And the Roman seal was placed on the tomb, which means that Caesar himself, right, the dictates of all of Rome said, trust me, no one's getting in this place. And a whole bunch of people who, they lose their leader. They were terrified when he was alive. Then he dies, and they go, now we're really going to kick into gear and go save him. None of that makes sense. And then you find women finding the empty tomb. Women gave the witness. If I'm writing a book, a hoax of what happened, trying to make myself look good, would I ever write that women found the tomb? That 12 men are sitting in a room terrified, and 2 women are the only ones with the audacity to go find it. In that day and age, Josephus tells us, a famous historian, he says women weren't even allowed to testify in court, and yet they're the ones who found the tomb. If I was writing this book, I would never make myself look so foolish as to say women were the ones. And in that day and age, that would have been such a slap in the face. But the Bible is saying it's embarrassing, but it's true for us. In our culture, it wouldn't be embarrassing at all. In fact, women and men are the exact same testimony in court, but back then it was nowhere near the same. These are all the minimalist facts. James, the brother of Jesus, is the first person to start the church in Jerusalem, and he's killed for starting the church. 11 of the 12 disciples are killed for their belief. The minimalist facts are there were 11 people who claimed that Jesus came back from the dead. They never once recanted, and they were all slaughtered for it. Paul went from being a Pharisee. It is proven that he then became a Jesus follower, and he was killed in Nero's circus for believing that. There are 2 women who found the tomb. There are Roman centurions who were overtaken by a group of disciples who were previously terrified. There's a prophecy 300 years ahead of time that Jesus would do what he said he would do, of which the odds are 1 in 10 to the 45th power for only 16, of which there are 300, 1,500 years, 40 different authors, 3 different continents, 3 different languages, all telling one same story. In conclusion, you are valuable, man messed up, Jesus redeemed it, and now he expects something from us. There's a movement, there's a change. I want you, Jesus says, to know about this. And the stack of evidence is so incredibly deep that he doesn't want anyone to get confused. But I want you to check your heart on this. If you still have pushback, come to the forum and get those answered. But the majority of us who have pushback, it's not because we actually have pushback, it's because our heart doesn't want it to be true. If you've got actual, factual, evidentiary pushback to it, would you ask someone? Would you have the bravery to come and ask those questions? But my guess is pretty strong, and my inkling is that you just don't want to know the truth. Prove me wrong. Come ask those questions. But I love how forward Jesus is with who he is. He says, take the minimalist facts, dig in the ground 25,000 times. I'm going to have all these people coming together. Every argument you make can be pushed back against. And after all these digs, after all this verification from manuscript, archaeological, prophetic evidence, from the scientific method to the bibliographical, internal, external evidence, everything over these thousands of, it's all going to line up to one thing. This book is testable, it is falsifiable, and yet it is proven to be true. And if it's true, my argument is you should probably put your chips in on what it says. That's what I did. It's not because it just worked for me. It's not because it felt right. It's simply that given all the evidence, the burden of proof was too strong. And I submitted my life, and I bent my knee and said, I'm giving my life to this thing. I would challenge you to look at the evidence. And if this has stirred something in your heart, the call is simple. turn your life over to Jesus. Maybe through this series, it's been pushing on you. Find one of us. I'll be at the forum on Sunday night. You can talk to me if you want to, talk to someone else. But if there's been a knocking on your heart, that's not nothing, that's the Holy Spirit saying, this is real, and it's time. We would love to see you, we'd love to talk to you, and we'd love for you to give your life to Jesus. He's the one with following, and he doesn't ask you to check your brain at the door. He says, bring it with you, because the evidence of my existence is written everywhere. See you guys Sunday night.